The mountains of northern Colorado were not gentle guardians but stern overseers, rising with jagged ridges and winds that howled through the pines like ancient spirits. In that harsh land Alejandro Cruz had built his life, his fortune, and his identity. Cielo Verde Ranch stretched across 800 acres of rolling pasture and rocky foothills, a place that held the laughter of his youth, the echoes of his grandmother Rosa's voice, and the steady rhythm of hooves against the earth. Yet in the autumn of that year, Alejandro felt those mountains closing in on him like prison walls. The troubles had begun with whispers, then with the silence of empty stalls. Horses vanishing without trace, each disappearance slicing deeper into Alejandro's heart and his livelihood. Lucero, the bright filly destined to shine in competition, gone as though she had dissolved into mist. Airo, the gelding with muscle built for cutting contests, vanished under a locked gate. Alondra, Arroyo, Niebla, names that had meaning beyond price tags, spirited away one by one. By September, Alejandro had lost nearly a quarter of his prized bloodline. Animals worth hundreds of thousands, but worth more still in memory and potential. The sheriff's deputy, Harlan Pike, offered him nothing but contempt, disguised as indifference. Maybe they jumped the fences, he suggested, as if the carefully maintained barriers and secure latches could be undone by whimsy. Alejandro had combed the forests for days, his voice shredded by calling until only silence answered back. Not a hair, not a hoofprint, not a broken branch. It was theft, precise and professional, yet no one seemed to believe him. Debt collectors did, the bank did. Whispers in the horse world traveled faster than wildfire. Buyers pulled out of contracts, insurance adjusters delayed and denied, creditors closed in. Cielo Verde Ranch, once the pride of Colorado, teetered on the edge of collapse. Alejandro stood in his barn at night and stared at the empty stalls, feeling as though pieces of his soul had been stolen, along with his animals. In those hours, he remembered Abuela Rosa, her wrinkled hands on his shoulders, her voice like steady drum beats. Los caballos ven el alma, horses see the soul. She had taught him that horses were not property, but guardians, companions who chose their people with wisdom beyond human comprehension. Alejandro had lived by those words, breeding not just for muscle or conformation, but for heart and intelligence. His stallion, Sol Dorado, was living proof of that creed, golden-coated, sharp-eyed, carrying bloodlines that traced back to legends. Sol Dorado stood now in his paddock, watching his master with eyes full of knowing, as if he too sensed the darkness circling the ranch. It was in this crucible of despair that Trueno appeared. The morning had broken crisp and thin, the kind of morning when frost laced the grass and every breath carried smoke into the pale sky. Alejandro carried buckets to the troughs, his body moving with the weary habit of chores performed through heartache. He heard nothing at first, only the shuffle of hooves from the remaining mares, the creak of leather gloves against wooden handles. But when he turned, his gaze caught a figure at the tree line. A Mustang, not the glossy kind paraded in festivals or painted across calendars, but a survivor, scarred and weather-beaten, carrying the weight of winters that would have killed softer creatures. The stallion's coat was dun gray, with a dark dorsal stripe cutting down his back like a sword mark. His mane whipped in the breeze, tangled and coarse, yet regal in its own raw way. He did not move. He stood there, utterly still, eyes fixed on Alejandro. Those eyes stopped Alejandro cold. They were not the frightened eyes of a wild animal, nor the dull gaze of a domesticated beast. They were deep, dark pools with a glimmer that spoke of knowledge, burdens carried, and secrets witnessed. Alejandro felt a prickle across his arms, as if unseen hands had brushed his skin. For a moment he thought of Abuela's words, "Horses see the soul," and he wondered if this creature was staring straight through the walls he had built around his grief. He dropped the bucket and took a tentative step forward. The Mustang's ears flicked, nostrils flaring as he scented the air. Alejandro did not speak at first. He simply stood, letting the animal study him, letting silence bridge the impossible gap between man and beast. Minutes passed, stretched taut like wire. Then, softly, Alejandro whispered the word that had carried from his grandmother's lips when she spoke to animals and children alike. Buen hermano. Good brother. The stallion's head tilted. A low nicker rolled from his throat, not quite greeting, not quite warning, a sound that stirred Alejandro's heart with unease and wonder alike. He froze, waiting, unwilling to impose. The Mustang stepped forward once, a single hoof pressed into the frosted earth, then stopped again. It was a gesture full of intent, deliberate as any word. Alejandro felt the hair at the back of his neck rise. For the next 3 days the ritual repeated. At dawn, when Alejandro went to feed Sol Dorado and the remaining stock, Trueno would be there, at the edge of the forest, silent sentinel. He neither advanced nor retreated, but his presence carried purpose. On the 4th day, Alejandro chose to test fate. He leaned against the fence, his breath clouding the morning air, and he began to speak in Spanish, not commands, not coaxing, but truth. He told the Mustang of the missing horses, of the thefts that bled his ranch dry. He confessed his fears, the looming foreclosure, the creditors that circled like vultures, the shame of losing what his family had built. His voice cracked as he spoke, and, to his astonishment, the stallion's ears swiveled forward as though every word mattered. Trueno did not move until Alejandro fell silent. Then perhaps they also see the truth. "All right," Alejandro said aloud, "show me." Trueno wheeled and entered the trees without hesitation. Alejandro's boots bit into the earth as he followed, the cold air sharp in his lungs. The forest closing around him with shadows and the faint tang of pine. Paths twisted through aspen and fir, trails Alejandro had ridden dozens of times. Yet Trueno chose routes he had never noticed. The Mustang moved with the assurance of generations born to wild land, hooves striking stone and soil with rhythm older than any map. Alejandro pushed himself to keep pace, heart pounding with anticipation and dread. As the terrain grew steeper, Alejandro realized they were heading toward the northeastern reaches of his property, a place he rarely visited. Too rocky for pasture, too remote for training, it had always been a buffer of wilderness, a margin between Cielo Verde and the outside world. Now that wilderness opened itself with secrets Alejandro had never dreamed were there. The trail crested a ridge, then dipped sharply into a narrow valley, hidden by towering stone walls. Alejandro stopped, breath caught in his throat. The valley stretched like a wound carved into the mountainside, a mile long, half as wide, invisible from above. And unlike the autumn-browned slopes elsewhere, the grass here shimmered green, lush and unnaturally tended. Irrigation lines glistened in the morning light, weaving across the meadow. This was no untouched land. Alejandro's pulse thundered. Trueno walked steadily ahead, guiding him deeper. Alejandro's eyes caught shapes rising in the center of the valley, rectangles of corrals assembled from portable panels, their neat geometry jarring against the natural curves of the land. Nearby stood loading ramps, equipment positioned for efficiency, for swift disappearance. A chill crawled along Alejandro's spine. It was a holding pen, a temporary prison for animals stolen under night's cover, concealed here until papers could be forged, until trucks arrived to ferry them away. The precision of it, the professionalism, spoke of organization beyond mere rustlers. This was a machine, one that devoured bloodlines and spit out profit. Alejandro's heart pounded in his ears. Trueno turned once, glancing back at him, eyes fierce with an unspoken demand. See, know, believe, and Alejandro did. At the far end of the valley, a cabin crouched among the pines, built from rough timber and stone, a chimney rising with the gleam of mounted communication gear. Solar panels angled on the roof caught the pale sun. Smoke curled from the chimney, the faint smell of wood fire reaching Alejandro's nostrils. Someone lived here, someone who knew. Trueno raised his head and gave a low, rumbling nicker that echoed across the valley. The cabin door opened. A woman stepped out onto the porch, her auburn braid catching the light, her stance alert, hardened by years of labor and vigilance. She wore denim and canvas, boots scuffed with use, and her eyes, those eyes, struck Alejandro with the same shock as Trueño's. Intelligent, weary, secrets layered deep. Alejandro's world tilted. Whoever this stranger was, she had been waiting. And Trueño had brought him here for a reason. The wind rose in the valley, carrying the scent of pine and smoke, and Alejandro Cruz stood rooted to the earth, knowing that the next words, the next choice, would change his life forever. The name Cielo Verde carried weight across the horse world, a name built on years of grit, patience, and devotion. Alejandro Cruz had inherited the ranch not as a gift, but as a burden tempered by love. When Abuela Rosa passed, she left him both land and creed. "Horses see the soul," she had whispered, a reminder that his work was not about transactions but about trust. For years, that belief had guided Alejandro as he bred horses not only for athletic strength, but for intelligence and spirit. Buyers came from distant states, seeking the foals of Sol Dorado, his golden stallion, whose blood traced back to champions. Cielo Verde foals sold for $20,000, $30,000, even more at auctions, and Alejandro's reputation grew until his name was spoken with reverence at stock shows. But success was fragile, balanced on perception and relationships, and it could shatter overnight. The first blow fell with the disappearance of Lucero. She was a filly barely 3 years old, but already her movements turned the heads of seasoned trainers. Alejandro had placed her in the north pasture, envisioning the saddle training to begin the following week. He went to bed thinking of her bright future, but by morning the pasture was empty. No fence broken, no sign of struggle, only silence. He searched until his throat bled with her name. Days of riding the ridges, pushing into canyons, peering under pines, all met with nothing. Deputy Harlan Pike came once, boots crunching against dry grass, hat pulled low. "Maybe she cleared the fence," he said with a shrug. "Quarter horses are athletes." "Maybe she is running wild in the national forest." His words were careless knives. Alejandro pointed to the sturdy rails, the smooth ground with no hoofprints, the absence of any disturbance. The deputy's eyes stayed flat, uninterested, as though Alejandro's desperation were an inconvenience to his schedule. 2 weeks later, Aero was gone. A gelding built for the cutting futurity circuit, muscles like coiled rope, worth $40,000 on the open market. Taken from a locked paddock overnight, the gate latch remained secure. No sound had stirred the ranch dogs, no lights flashed across the fields. Aero had vanished as cleanly as Lucero. Then Alondra, heavy with foal, her belly rounding with Sol Dorado's lineage, disappeared. Then Arroyo, a stallion prospect with perfect conformation. Then Niebla, the broodmare whose foals had already carried home ribbons from 3 states. Each absence struck deeper, each loss not just of value but of memory, years of training, hope, and lineage. Alejandro stood in the barn and counted emptiness. Stalls that once smelled of hay and horseflesh now breathed only dust. He would run his hands along worn boards and remember the warmth of bodies no longer there. Insurance adjusters delayed claims, muttering about investigations. The bank called daily, a clock ticking against him. Prospective buyers canceled contracts as rumors spread. In the close-knit world of breeders, whispers traveled faster than horses themselves. Cielo Verde had problems. Its bloodlines were compromised. At night, Alejandro lay awake and stared at the rafters, his chest heavy with more than debt. These horses were not livestock. They were beings he had helped into the world, watched wobble on new legs, guided with gentle reins. Each loss felt like a theft of his very soul. He remembered Lucero's curious eyes, Aero's explosive start, Alondra's calm patience. Gone, each one, and he powerless to protect them. He thought of Abuela Rosa then, her voice rising like prayer. "Horses are guardians," she said. "They choose who is worthy." Alejandro wondered what she would think now, seeing his herd vanish, his legacy stripped away. He pictured her grave beneath the cottonwood, wondered if she knew that everything she had given him was unraveling thread by thread. The creditors circled. Letters came stamped in red. Calls grew sharper. The mortgage itself hung by a thread, and foreclosure loomed like thunder. Alejandro rode Sol Dorado out into the fields at dusk and tried to lose himself in the rhythm of hooves. The stallion moved with effortless grace, a reminder of what remained, but even his presence could not erase the ache of absence. One evening, as he leaned against the fence, Alejandro whispered into the fading light, "I cannot hold this alone." His words dissipated into the air, unanswered. The dogs barked once, then settled. The mountains offered no comfort. Each morning the losses grew heavier, the silence sharper. The ranch hands avoided his eyes, their loyalty strained by wages delayed. Alejandro sold equipment, pared down expenses, yet the ledger bled red ink. His reputation bled faster. Where once breeders called to negotiate foals, now calls came only from creditors. He tried to fight back. He reinforced fences, installed cameras, hired a night watchman. Yet still the pattern continued, precise, professional, leaving no trace. Whoever took his horses knew the land, knew his routines, knew how to erase footprints and silence alarms. It was not random theft. It was something larger, something calculated. Alejandro felt it in his bones, but each day that passed without answers left him more alone in his certainty. And then there was the shame. At auctions and shows he felt eyes on him, whispers trailing in his wake. Cruz cannot keep his herd safe. Cielo Verde is cursed. Buyers withdrew, contracts died, respect dissolved into suspicion. He wore his pride like armor, but inside he felt hollow. At dawn he often walked the empty pastures, dew soaking his boots, the chill of mountain air pressing against his chest. He would stand at the far fence line, staring into the trees, and wonder if his horses called to him from somewhere unseen. Sometimes he swore he heard a faint nicker in the wind, a ghostly echo of voices stolen. Those mornings bled into one another until his days became a pattern of loss. Each feeding, each ride, each inspection carried the shadow of absence. Sol Dorado whinnied in the paddock, restless as though sensing predators beyond the fence. Alejandro stroked his golden neck, whispering comfort more for himself than the horse. Debt, shame, silence. That was the legacy left to him now, broken and bleeding. But destiny often walks in the silence between breaths, and one morning, as Alejandro lifted hay into the trough, he felt the weight of unseen eyes. He turned toward the tree line and saw Trueno for the first time. The Mustang stood like a statue carved of stone and storm, scars etched into his hide, mane tangled with the wind. His eyes met Alejandro's across the distance, dark and fathomless, cutting through despair like a blade. Alejandro froze, his body a taut wire of disbelief. It was not the appearance of a wild horse that unnerved him, but the presence in those eyes. Knowledge, witness, a burden carried. Alejandro's breath caught. Abuela Rosa's words whispered again in memory. Horses see the soul. In that moment, he felt seen. Stripped of defenses, his despair laid bare under the scrutiny of a wild guardian. The world fell still, the only sound the heartbeat thundering in his ears. He knew, with a certainty that shook him, that this Mustang had come with purpose. And thus the broken legacy of Cielo Verde hung on a fragile thread of hope, embodied in the gaze of a scarred stallion who had chosen to appear at the very moment when Alejandro stood on the brink of ruin. The first morning Alejandro Cruz saw the wild Mustang Trueno at the fence line, he thought it was chance. The second morning he began to wonder. The third morning he knew it was not chance at all. Every dawn the scarred stallion appeared from the pines like a phantom called by fate, standing still, eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made the hair on his arms lift. It was as if the creature had taken a place among the chores, as much a presence as the troughs and the hay bales, yet one that carried with it the weight of mystery. On the fourth morning, Alejandro decided silence was no longer enough. He leaned against the rough timber of the fence, breath steaming in the crisp October air, and spoke in Spanish. He told Trueno what he had not been able to tell another living soul. His voice broke as he admitted that his horses were being stolen, that the insurance company denied his claims, that the bank circled with foreclosure papers ready. He confessed that he was losing the very legacy his grandmother Rosa had entrusted to him. As his words fell into the air, the Mustang's ears swiveled, nostrils flaring, eyes locked with unwavering attention. Alejandro felt foolish, yet he could not stop. He spoke of Lucero, of Arrow, of Alondra heavy with foal, of Arroyo and Niebla. He spoke of the silence in the barn, of creditors hammering at his gates, of nights when shame and grief pressed against his chest until he could barely breathe. The forest was his only witness. And Trueno. When his confession dwindled into silence, the Mustang took a step closer. The movement was slow, deliberate, filled with intent. Alejandro's heart hammered. He whispered, "You know something, don't you?" The stallion turned then, walked several yards along the fence, and stopped. He looked back, eyes piercing. The message was undeniable. "Follow me." Alejandro hesitated. The sun had barely risen and chores waited, yet what were chores when weighed against the chance of truth? He had reinforced the fences, hired hands, added cameras, but none of it had saved his horses. If this wild guardian carried even a shred of knowledge, he had to follow. The ranch was crumbling beneath him. Pride alone would not save it. "All right," he said, "show me." Trueno turned into the forest, his stride steady, confident. Alejandro swung his leg over the fence and followed. The ground crunched under his boots, the cold biting into his lungs. Pine needles carpeted the trail, muffling his steps, while Trueno moved with silent grace. The Mustang knew the land as if it had been born from it, weaving through aspen groves, choosing paths invisible to Alejandro, though he had ridden these hills since boyhood. The climb grew steep. Alejandro stumbled on loose rock but pressed on, his breath harsh. The Mustang never faltered, hooves precise and sure. It was not a wanderer's path, but a purposeful one, leading deeper into country Alejandro had always considered nothing more than buffer land. Rocky, remote, too wild to be of use. He realized with a jolt that this remoteness made it perfect for concealment. They crested a ridge. Alejandro paused, wiping sweat from his brow, though the morning was cold. Beyond lay a narrow valley hidden by stone walls. He had never seen it marked on maps. From above, it looked untouched. Yet as they descended, he saw grass impossibly green for the season, shimmering with irrigation. His pulse quickened. In the heart of the valley rose corrals built from portable panels, their sharp angles cutting into the meadow like scars. Loading ramps stood nearby. Alejandro's breath caught. These were not relics or ruins. They were fresh, functional. A holding ground. The realization hit like a blow. This was where his horses had been taken, hidden, catalogued, prepared for shipment. It was theft executed with military precision. He gripped the fence post beside him until his knuckles whitened. Rage and vindication churned together in his chest. He had been right. This was not random. Trueno stood poised, head high, eyes locked on Alejandro as if demanding recognition of the truth. Alejandro whispered a prayer to Abuela Rosa, half gratitude, half fear. Horses see the soul. Perhaps they also see the path. At the far end of the valley, a cabin stood among the pines, stone and timber, smoke curling from its chimney. Solar panels glinted on the roof, antennae jutted from the chimney stack. Someone lived here, someone who knew. Trueno nickered, a low rumble that vibrated through the valley. The cabin door opened. A woman stepped onto the porch, auburn hair braided, sun-weathered skin, posture alert. She wore denim and boots, clothes made for work, not display. But it was her eyes that struck Alejandro, eyes as deep and weary as Trueno's, layered with intelligence and guarded secrets. Alejandro froze, his heart leaping. The stallion had not led him to emptiness, but to revelation. The woman spoke his name with quiet authority. Alejandro Cruz. Her voice carried knowledge, as if she had been waiting. She glanced at the Mustang. "I wondered when Trueno would bring you here." The world shifted beneath Alejandro's feet. This was not chance, not despair's hallucination. Trueno had delivered him to someone who held answers. The scarred Mustang had not only heard his confession, but chosen to guide him toward truth. Alejandro stood trembling in the valley, understanding with dawning clarity that his life was about to change. And in the stillness, the signal of Trueno echoed louder than any word. The cabin at the far end of the valley exhaled smoke from its chimney as if it were a living thing, breathing secrets into the crisp mountain air. Alejandro Cruz stood rooted in place, his heart hammering, as the woman on the porch fixed him with a gaze that felt both appraising and fated. She knew his name before he gave it, and she knew the Mustang, too. Trueno stood close, his scarred body steady as stone, his dark eyes glinting with the same intelligence that lived in the woman's stare. Alejandro took a slow step forward, boots crunching against frost-hardened grass. His voice rasped from his throat, dry as the pine needles that littered the forest floor.
"Who are you?" The woman did not move, but her eyes flickered with something, recognition, perhaps sorrow. "My name is Dr. Valeria Marquez," she said. "I am an equine veterinarian. My specialty is bloodline authentication and fraud detection. And for months now, I have been documenting what has been happening to your horses." The words struck him with the force of a blow. His chest tightened, and he struggled to process them. All at once, the corrals, the hidden valley, the solar panels and antennas on the roof, the eerie presence of Trueno, every puzzle piece locked into place. "You know about Lucero, about Arrow, Alondra, all of them." His voice cracked on the last words, rage and grief spilling out. Valeria's eyes softened, though her mouth remained a firm line. "I know, Alejandro. I know exactly what happened. I have the evidence here." She gestured to the cabin behind her. Her hand trembled slightly, betraying nerves beneath the calm exterior. Trueno gave a low rumble, as if urging Alejandro forward. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and call the sheriff, to bring armed lawmen into this hidden place. Yet something deeper than instinct kept him rooted. It was the same force that had compelled him to follow Trueno into the wilderness. He thought of Abuela Rosa and her belief that horses saw into the soul. If Trueno had brought him here, it meant there was truth waiting inside. Alejandro climbed the porch steps. Valeria pushed open the cabin door, and the smell of cedar smoke and something metallic drifted out. Inside the dimly lit space, Alejandro froze. The cabin was not a simple mountain refuge. It was a nerve center. Along one wall, banks of monitors flickered with surveillance feeds, cameras showing angles of the valley, trails winding through the forest, even a distant glimpse of his ranch pastures. On another wall hung photographs, images that made his blood turn cold. Lucero being loaded into a trailer under the cover of night. Arrow restrained, his head tossing in panic as strangers fastened restraints. Alondra, heavy with foal, her terrified eyes flashing in the green glow of a night vision camera. Alejandro's knees weakened. He gripped the edge of a wooden table to steady himself. "You have been watching them, watching my ranch." Valeria nodded, her face etched with regret. "Yes, but not as an accomplice, as a witness. I have been gathering proof, piece by piece, so that what is happening cannot be denied or dismissed." She crossed the room and pulled a thick folder from a stack on the table. With deliberate care, she spread documents across the surface. Auction records, transport manifests, falsified registration papers with embossed seals that looked authentic to any untrained eye. Alejandro stared down at one document in disbelief. It was a bill of sale from an auction house in Kentucky. Lucero listed as sold for $85,000. His hands trembled as he traced the letters of her name. She had been worth more to him than gold, not because of money but because of promise, of the bond they had shared since her first trembling steps. "They are not killing them," Valeria said softly. "They are stealing them for their bloodlines. Once the paperwork is forged, they disappear into elite breeding programs across the country. Buyers pay fortunes for them, believing they are legitimate stock. Your horses are alive, Alejandro, but they have been sold under false names and false heritage." The weight of her words pressed down on him. Relief battled with fury inside his chest. Alive, yet stolen into false lives. The betrayal cut deeper than death. "This requires access to the American Quarter Horse Association's registration systems," Alejandro muttered, scanning the paperwork. "This is not the work of backwoods thieves." Valeria met his eyes. "You are right. This operation is not random. It is organized, professional, and it reaches into the highest levels of the horse industry." She tapped another document. Here. It bore the logo of Equestrian Heritage Services, a name Alejandro recognized instantly.
one of the largest trading operations in the country, specializing in connecting wealthy buyers with exceptional horses. His voice dropped to a whisper. They're behind it. Valeria nodded. Yes. For 5 years they have been quietly cornering the market on premium bloodlines. Not through legitimate purchase, but through theft. They steal horses from small breeders like you, forge registration papers, and sell them with inflated pedigrees. Her hands shuffled through more records. Financial spreadsheets, DNA test results altered to match fabricated bloodlines. Photographs of men Alejandro did not recognize, but whose cold faces marked them as professionals. The fraud is worth hundreds of millions, Valeria continued. And it is not just about money. By concentrating the best bloodlines into the hands of a few wealthy clients, they are destroying genetic diversity across the breed. If this continues, independent breeders will vanish. The integrity of quarter horses in America will collapse. Alejandro sank into a chair, his mind spinning. He thought of Sol Dorado, his golden stallion, his pride. He thought of Lucero, of Aero, of the others who had been raised under his care. They were more than property. They were blood, spirit, legacy. Now their very identities had been stolen, rewritten by criminals who saw only profit. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why trust me?" Valeria hesitated, then pulled a photograph from the folder. It showed her in a tailored suit, standing beside a man in an expensive jacket at a horse show. She tapped the man's face. Vincent Ashworth, founder and CEO of Equestrian Heritage, my former employer. Alejandro stared, fury coiling in his chest. "You worked for them?" "4 years, Valeria admitted. "I was their chief veterinary consultant, responsible for authenticating bloodlines. At first I believed in the work, then I discovered discrepancies in DNA results. Horses claimed to be from Texas tested as stock stolen from New Mexico. I confronted Ashworth. He dismissed me, told me paperwork gets lost, that my job was to focus on health, not pedigrees." Her eyes darkened, but I could not ignore it. Families were losing everything. Bloodlines decades in the making vanished overnight. I began documenting in secret. When they discovered I knew too much, I was fired. I received threats, lawsuits. I had to disappear. She gestured around the cabin. "This is where I went. Here I have gathered proof, but I cannot fight them alone." Alejandro felt the room close in around him. Surveillance photos of his ranch. Documents that exposed fraud worth millions. A wild Mustang that had led him here as if guided by unseen hands. And the woman who had once worked for the very people destroying his life, now claiming to be his ally. He thought of the bank letters, the calls from creditors, the shame in the eyes of his ranch hands. He thought of Rosa's voice, "Horses see the soul." Perhaps Trueno had seen his. Valeria's voice cut through his thoughts. Tonight they planned to strike again. Marcus Webb, Ashworth's field supervisor, will lead his men to your ranch. They mean to take everything that remains. Sol Dorado, your broodmares, even the yearlings. All of it. Alejandro's body went rigid. "How do you know this?" She pointed to the monitors. "We have been intercepting their communications for weeks. The plan is meticulous. They will come with trailers, sedatives, equipment to erase your security feeds. They want to finish what they started." Alejandro rose to his feet, fury surging. "Not this time." Valeria's eyes locked onto his. "Then help me. Together we can stop them. I have law enforcement contacts, journalists, other breeders ready to act. But we need you, Alejandro. Your testimony, your credibility, your courage." He thought of Trueno, standing watch outside, a silent guardian who had seen into his soul and judged him worthy. He thought of his grandmother and the creed she had entrusted to him. The ranch may be on the edge of ruin, but Alejandro Cruz would not allow its soul to be stolen. Alejandro Cruz sat at the rough wooden table in Valeria Marquez's cabin, staring at the documents that littered the surface like shards of a shattered mirror. Bills of sale bearing the names of horses he had raised since birth. Auction records with numbers that dwarfed anything he had ever received. registration papers with pedigrees twisted by fraud. Each page felt like a knife cutting deeper into the heart of his legacy. Valeria stood beside him, arms crossed, her face illuminated by the pale glow of the surveillance monitors. The images shifted from one camera feed to another, displaying the valley, the forest trails, the ranch house, far in the distance. Every flicker reminded Alejandro that his life had been watched, studied, dismantled without his knowledge. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. Finally, Alejandro whispered, "My horses are alive." Valeria nodded. Alive, but enslaved to false names and false bloodlines, sold to buyers who never questioned the authenticity of their papers. The thought filled him with a surge of rage that made his hands tremble. Relief and fury warred inside him. Relief that his beloved animals had not been slaughtered. Fury that they had been stolen into a world where they were valued only as currency. He slammed his fist onto the table, the sound echoing through the cabin. "They are not merchandise," he said, voice rough. "They are family, each one." Valeria's eyes softened, though her tone remained sharp with urgency. "That is why you must fight back. They will not stop with you. They will continue until every independent breeder is destroyed." Alejandro lifted his gaze to her. "Why me? Why bring this burden to me?" "Because you still have something they want," she answered. "Sol Dorado, your stallion is the key to everything. His bloodlines are legendary. They have already falsified dozens of pedigrees using his name, but they want the source. If they take him, there will be no way to stop their lies." The words landed like heavy stones on Alejandro's chest. He pictured the golden stallion standing in the paddock, head high, eyes bright. Sol Dorado was more than his prize. He was a symbol of Rosa's vision, of everything Cielo Verde had built. If the thieves took him, they would not just destroy Alejandro's ranch. They would corrupt the very foundation of the breed. Valeria placed a hand on the stack of documents. "This is why Trueno brought you here. Horses see the soul. The Mustang knew you could not look away once you saw the truth." Alejandro turned to the window. Outside, Trueno stood motionless, scars stark against his dark hide, his eyes glinting in the twilight. A guardian, silent but unyielding. Valeria's voice broke the stillness. "There is more you must understand." She crossed to a locked trunk in the corner, knelt, and pulled out a digital recorder. With a click, a voice filled the cabin, cold and businesslike. "Acquire the broodmares first, the stallion last. Papers will be ready by the end of the month. Buyers are already lined up." Alejandro stiffened. That voice. Vincent Ashworth, Valeria confirmed, founder of Equestrian Heritage. Another voice followed, deeper, laced with authority. "Marcus Webb, field operations. He handles the thefts." The two men discussed ranches as though they were inventory sheets, calculating bloodline value, debating timing. Alejandro's ranch was mentioned by name, his horses listed like commodities. The casual cruelty made his stomach twist. Valeria shut off the recorder. "This is what I risked everything to capture. They think themselves untouchable. They employ former federal agents. They donate to campaigns. They hide behind legitimate business fronts. Law enforcement hesitates because of their influence. But I have built a network. Breeders, journalists, a few honest agents. We are gathering proof too large to ignore." Alejandro rubbed his temples. It felt as though the room spun around him. "You cannot expect me to fight giants. I expect you to stand with the truth," Valeria replied firmly. "Tonight they will come, Webb and his men. They will attempt to clear your ranch completely. I need you to be there, to witness, to testify. Without you, the evidence can be dismissed as hearsay. With you, it becomes undeniable." Alejandro thought of the sheriff who had shrugged off Lucero's disappearance, of the creditors circling like vultures, of the whispers at auctions. He thought of Rosa's faith and Trueno's unwavering gaze. "What choice do I have?" he murmured. "If I do nothing, I lose everything. If I fight, I may lose more." Valeria placed a folder before him. Inside were photographs of other ranchers, Men and women he did not know, but whose eyes told familiar stories: loss, anger, resilience. Each had been marked by theft. Each had seen their legacies vanish. "They are with us," she said. "You will not stand alone." The weight of truth pressed down on Alejandro's shoulders, heavy yet clarifying. For months he had stumbled in the dark, mocked by silence, betrayed by indifference. Now he saw the shape of the enemy, vast and ruthless. Fear pulsed through him, but alongside it grew something sharper: resolve. He looked back at Valeria. "If I do this, if I stand with you, they will come after me. Ashworth, Webb, their lawyers, their money. They will try to destroy me." "They already are," she said quietly. "At least this way you strike back." Alejandro exhaled slowly, the decision forming like steel in his chest. He thought of Sol Dorado's golden coat gleaming in the moonlight, of Lucero's bright eyes, of Iro's strength. He thought of Trueno leading him here, choosing him. Horses see the soul. Perhaps now it was time for his soul to see clearly too. He nodded once, firm. "Tell me what must be done." Valeria's lips curved into the faintest smile, weary yet relieved. "Tonight we prepare. Webb's men will come from the south. We have cameras ready, GPS trackers hidden, law enforcement on standby. But you must be ready to bear witness." Alejandro rose, the weight of truth settling fully upon him. He glanced once more at the monitors, at the photographs, at the damning evidence spread across the table. The fraud was vast, the enemy powerful, but the path was clear. Trueno stamped a hoof outside, as if to punctuate the moment. Alejandro met the Mustang's eyes through the window. For the first time in months, he felt something stir in his chest that had been absent since the first horse vanished. Hope, fierce and fragile, yet alive. He turned back to Valeria. "Then, let us prepare. Tonight, they will learn that Cielo Verde does not surrender." The sun fell behind the jagged ridges of the Colorado Rockies, spilling crimson light across the valley floor as Alejandro Cruz returned to Cielo Verde with Valeria Marquez at his side. Trueno lingered near the tree line, his silhouette sharp against the fading sky, a sentinel carved in shadow. The air carried the kind of silence that always precedes upheaval, a silence too heavy to be trusted. Alejandro's boots crunched on the gravel of the ranch yard. Every sound seemed amplified: the creak of the barn door, the nervous shuffle of horses in their stalls, the faint whir of the security cameras he had installed, but which he now knew could not withstand the precision of the men who were coming. He stroked Sol Dorado's golden neck, feeling the stallion's warmth seep into his palm. Dorado's nostrils flared, ears swiveling toward the forest as if he already sensed the danger. Valeria moved quickly, scanning the perimeter with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to betrayal. She set her laptop on the tack room counter, the screen glowing pale in the gloom. Lines of encrypted communication scrolled across it, intercepted fragments from Webb's crew. "The time is set, the sweep is clean, targets confirmed." Alejandro clenched his fists. The language reduced his horses, his family, to mere objects. It stoked a fire in him hotter than fear. Valeria spoke without looking up. "They will approach from the south trail, around 2 in the morning. 12 men, 2 trailers, 3 trucks. They will disable your cameras, jam your signals, and load the herd within 30 minutes." Her calm delivery only sharpened the edges of the threat. Alejandro swallowed hard. "And you are certain law enforcement will come?" Valeria's eyes flicked to him. "Yes, but they cannot move until the theft is underway. They need incontrovertible evidence. Until then it will be you, me, and Trueno." Alejandro glanced toward the wild Mustang still holding his post at the tree line. For reasons he could not articulate, he trusted Trueno's instincts more than any camera or weapon. The scars etched across the Mustang's body spoke of survival, of battles endured and won. If Trueno chose to remain, Alejandro felt less alone. The hours crawled. Alejandro and Valeria moved through the ranch with quiet urgency, placing hidden cameras at angles Webb's crew would not anticipate, positioning trackers within the pastures, checking the locks on gates they knew would be cut regardless. The ranch hands had been dismissed for the night. Alejandro claimed he needed solitude, but the truth was simpler: he would not put them in danger. This fight was his. Darkness settled fully, blanketing the land in a silence broken only by the distant howl of a coyote. Alejandro sat at the kitchen table,
the weight of exhaustion pressing against him, yet his mind refused rest. Rosa's words returned unbidden. Horses see the soul. He wondered if Trueno had seen something within him worth saving, or merely a man desperate enough to follow. Valeria entered quietly, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She set one before him. "You should rest," she said. He shook his head. "Rest will not come. Not tonight." She studied him, her face shadowed but her eyes steady. "You carry this as though it is only your burden, but it is not. I carry it too. So do dozens of breeders across this country. They have already lost everything. If we succeed tonight, you will not just save your horses, you will give them all a chance." Alejandro held her gaze. "And if we fail," her lips pressed into a thin line, "then you lose Dorado, the broodmares, the ranch, and perhaps more." The words hung heavy, but he did not look away. "Then we cannot fail." The night deepened. Midnight came and passed. The ranch lay hushed, yet Alejandro's pulse thundered with each passing minute. Valeria sat before her laptop, headphones pressed to her ears, intercepting faint bursts of encrypted chatter. Trueno remained near the south pasture, a shadowy guardian whose ears flicked constantly toward the forest. At 1:30, Valeria's posture stiffened. "Movement," she whispered. "They are close." Alejandro rose, his body tense, and moved to the observation post they had prepared on the ridge. The night vision scope painted the world in shades of green. The forest stirred. Shadows shifted. At 2:17, Trueno lifted his head, muscles taut, nostrils flaring. He stared south, and Alejandro knew before Valeria spoke. "They are here." Through the scope, Alejandro watched headlights extinguished as vehicles crept along the mountain trail. 2 horse trailers loomed behind heavy trucks, tires grinding softly against gravel. They moved with the precision of a military convoy, disciplined and silent. His chest tightened. These were not thieves of desperation. They were professionals, hardened and confident. The convoy halted at the tree line. Doors opened without sound. Men emerged in black tactical gear, faces obscured, movements efficient. Alejandro counted them, 12, just as Valeria had said. One man stepped forward, taller than the rest, posture commanding. Even from a distance his presence carried authority. Marcus Webb. Alejandro's jaw clenched as he watched Webb survey the land. The man's gestures were sharp, confident. Teams split into 3 groups, fanning across the property. One carried equipment that hummed faintly, signal jammers. Another cut through the first fence with bolt cutters that barely whispered against metal. Valeria whispered beside him, "Stay calm, let them act. We must record everything." Alejandro adjusted the camera, forcing his hands to remain steady, though every instinct screamed to charge down the ridge. He saw his horses lift their heads in alarm, ears swiveling, bodies tensing. Dorado stepped forward, his golden coat gleaming faintly in the moonlight, his posture fierce and protective. One of the thieves raised a device that emitted a shrill, almost inaudible frequency. The effect was immediate. Dorado reared, striking at the air, his scream slicing through the night. The broodmares shifted nervously, hooves pounding the earth in panic. Alejandro's heart twisted. To see his proud stallion disoriented, tortured by invisible sound, was agony. Valeria gripped his arm. "Hold, just a little longer." The thieves worked quickly, herding the disoriented horses into portable corrals. Their efficiency was terrifying. Every motion rehearsed, every tool ready. Alejandro felt tears sting his eyes as Dorado fought against the unseen assault, his body trembling with confusion. He whispered, "Forgive me, hold on." Valeria's voice in her earpiece was steady now. "Control, this is Overwatch. Targets are in play. We have full visual." Alejandro could hear faint voices responding through her comms, law enforcement agents waiting for the order. But still they held, gathering more evidence, letting Webb's arrogance damn him further. The clock stretched like a noose tightening around Alejandro's throat. 30 minutes to erase his life.
30 minutes to steal what generations had built. And yet every second documented, every action recorded, was another nail in Webb's empire. At last Valeria spoke into her mic with sharp authority. "Control, this is Overwatch. Evidence confirmed. Execute, execute, execute." The mountains erupted. Floodlights flared, helicopters thundered overhead, and agents burst from concealment with weapons raised. Shouts echoed across the valley. "Federal agents, drop your weapons, get on the ground." Panic fractured the thieves' discipline. Some froze, stunned by the ambush. Others bolted for the forest, only to be chased down by agents with night vision goggles and dogs trained for pursuit. Alejandro watched Marcus Webb turn, fury twisting his features, before armed men tackled him beside the trailer. The silence of the night shattered into chaos. Horses screamed, thieves shouted, agents barked commands. Alejandro felt his knees weaken with a mix of relief and disbelief. For months he had been alone in his grief. Now justice crashed down in light and thunder. Yet amid the chaos Trueno moved like a streak of shadow, racing down the hillside, hooves striking sparks against stone. Alejandro followed his path through the scope, heart hammering. The Mustang threaded between men and equipment with impossible precision, heading straight for one of the trailers. Valeria's voice cut through the din. "He is signaling something. Watch him." Trueno paced before the second trailer, nickering with distress, his head tossing, hooves pawing at the earth. Alejandro's breath caught. "He is telling us something." Agents swung the trailer doors open. Inside, beyond the panicked horses, were hidden compartments stacked with forged registration papers, genetic testing machines, and computers humming with stolen data. A treasure trove of evidence. "My God," one agent whispered, "this is not theft. This is an industry built on fraud." Alejandro gripped the camera tighter, his tears blurring the scope. Trueno had not only guided him to the truth, but ensured its revelation. The Mustang's scars, his presence, his silence, all had led to this. As Webb was dragged in cuffs toward the waiting vehicles, his face twisted in rage, Alejandro felt the storm inside him break. Relief poured through him like rain across parched land. The gathering storm had unleashed itself, and with it came the first glimpse of justice. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the ridges in pale gold while the valley below bore the scars of the night's battle. Trucks idled with their engines humming. Horse trailers stood open, and agents moved like ants across the grass, cataloging evidence, photographing equipment, and escorting captured thieves into armored vans. Alejandro Cruz stood near the corral fence, his body numb with exhaustion but his spirit quivering with something sharper than fatigue. Relief, fear, and a dawning awareness that nothing in his life would ever be the same. Saul Dorado stood tall despite the lingering tremors from the sonic weapon. His golden coat shimmered in the first rays of light, his eyes no longer clouded with confusion. When he saw Alejandro approach, he let out a deep nicker, lowering his head until his forehead pressed into Alejandro's chest. Tears slipped down Alejandro's cheeks as he wrapped his arms around the stallion's neck. "I thought I had lost you," he whispered, "but not this time." One by one the other horses emerged from the trailers, guided by agents with careful hands. Alondra, Arroyo, Niebla, each moved nervously, yet seemed to calm when they caught sight of Alejandro. They pressed close to him, their bodies warm, their eyes wide with recognition. The reunion felt like a resurrection, and Alejandro's heart ached with gratitude. Cameras flashed in the distance as journalists recorded every moment, broadcasting the images to a world hungry for both scandal and redemption. Valeria Marquez stood a few paces away, speaking with Agent Patricia Ramirez of the Federal Task Force. The two women exchanged papers, digital drives, and clipped phrases that carried the weight of triumph mixed with caution. When Alejandro approached, Ramirez extended her hand. "Senor Cruz, without your courage, this operation would not have been possible. We have evidence enough to bring charges that will shake the horse industry to its core." Alejandro shook her hand, but his eyes remained on his horses. "And what of them?" he asked. "What of their stolen names, their stolen heritage?" Ramirez's expression softened. "With the documents we have seized and the genetic equipment recovered, we can begin to restore true records. But it will take time. Decades of fraud will not unravel in a single trial. Valeria placed a hand on Alejandro's shoulder. This is only the beginning. Tonight we won a battle. The war is still ahead. As if summoned by her words, a convoy of black SUVs appeared on the ridge, descending the trail with controlled speed. Alejandro stiffened until he recognized the insignia on their doors: media outlets, legal representatives, politicians drawn by the scent of scandal. The ranch that had once been quiet, solitary, on the brink of foreclosure, was now the epicenter of a storm that would spread across the nation. By mid-morning, the yard buzzed with activity. Reporters crowded near the gates, shouting questions. Cameramen filmed the corral where Dorado and the mares grazed under the watchful eye of Trueno, who remained just beyond the fence line, calm yet alert. Every time a flashbulb popped, the Mustang lifted his head, ears flicking back in irritation, but he did not retreat. He seemed to understand his role was not finished. An aide from Ramirez's team pulled Alejandro aside, handing him a packet thick with legal warnings. Ashworth's lawyers are already filing motions, the aide said. They will come after you personally. Expect lawsuits, intimidation, character attacks. Alejandro closed the packet without reading it. Let them. They cannot steal what has already been returned. But as he said the words, doubt stirred. He had seen the reach of equestrian heritage, the way their influence crept into law enforcement and industry alike. A few arrests would not erase decades of corruption, and with his name now public, he had painted a target on his chest. Inside the ranch house, Alejandro slumped into a chair, his hands shaking as adrenaline ebbed. Valeria joined him, setting down 2 cups of strong coffee. "You should be proud," she said softly. "Few men would have had the courage to face what you did." He laughed bitterly. "Proud. I feel like a man stripped bare before the world. My debts still exist. My creditors will smell blood. And now every powerful enemy I never wanted knows my name." Valeria met his eyes steadily. "That is the price of exposure. Truth is never free. But you are not alone. There is a network behind you, breeders across the country who have suffered the same theft. You are their proof, their voice." Alejandro leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I never wanted to be anyone's voice. I only wanted to raise horses, to live quietly, to honor my grandmother's memory." Trueno's image returned to his mind, those deep eyes, that silent insistence. Horses choose their people. Perhaps Rosa had been right. Perhaps destiny had chosen him, unwilling though he might be. By afternoon, federal vans rolled out with Webb and his captured crew shackled inside. Ashworth had been arrested hours earlier in Denver, caught trying to destroy servers. News of his capture spread like fire through dry grass, igniting headlines across the country. For the first time in months, Alejandro's phone buzzed with calls not from creditors, but from journalists, breeders, even buyers seeking reassurance that Dorado's bloodlines were real, untouched by fraud. Alejandro ignored most of them. He walked the pastures instead, watching his horses graze as if nothing had happened. Yet everything had. The air itself seemed heavier, burdened with consequence. That evening, Ramirez gathered her team in the ranch yard. Alejandro stood beside Valeria as she addressed them. "The evidence seized tonight proves systematic fraud involving thousands of horses across at least 15 states. Financial records suggest profits exceeding $50 million. With this evidence, indictments will follow within weeks." She turned to Alejandro. "Your testimony will be vital. Are you prepared for that?" His throat tightened. Prepared or not, he had no choice. "I will testify." Valeria's hand brushed his arm, a fleeting touch filled with unspoken gratitude. Trueno watched from the ridge, his silhouette against the setting sun like a figure carved from myth. Alejandro wondered if the Mustang sensed the weight of history shifting on this land. Night fell again, quieter than the one before, yet still charged with tension. Alejandro lay awake, listening to the rustle of his horses in the pastures, the creak of the windmill, the faint hum of generators powering federal equipment still stationed nearby. Sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Webb's cold stare. Ashworth's smug smile. The shadow of enemies, yet unnamed. When dawn broke once more, he rose, weary but determined. The price of exposure was steep, but so too was the cost of silence. He had chosen his path. And though the road ahead promised trials, betrayal, and fear, it also promised justice. Not only for him, but for every breeder whose life had been stolen in the night. Outside, Trueno stood waiting, as if to remind him that guardians appear not to ease the path, but to demand its walking. Alejandro met the Mustang's gaze and nodded. The storm had only just begun. The morning after the raid brought no peace. Alejandro Cruz awoke to the shrill ring of his phone and the buzz of unanswered messages piling in like locusts. Reporters demanded interviews. Lawyers requested statements. Breeders begged for guidance. He silenced the device and stepped onto the porch, where the crisp mountain air offered little comfort. The valley stretched wide and golden under the rising sun, but Alejandro felt the net of consequences tightening around him. In the pastures, Sol Dorado stood tall, grazing among the broodmares with his usual dignity, though his ears twitched at every sound. The other horses pressed close together, unsettled by the chaos of the night before. And there, as constant as the dawn, Trueno lingered at the tree line, his scarred frame etched against the forest like an omen. Alejandro drew strength from the Mustang's presence, but also unease. Trueno's watchfulness carried a warning. This battle was far from finished. Inside the ranch house, Valeria Marquez hunched over her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. Streams of data scrolled across the screen, intercepted chatter, encrypted correspondence, financial records that painted a portrait of corruption deeper than even she had feared. She glanced up when Alejandro entered, her eyes sharp but rimmed with fatigue. "They are already mobilizing," she said. "Ashworth's lawyers are flooding the courts with motions. They will argue unlawful search, entrapment, fabricated evidence. Their influence runs deep. Some judges owe them favors." Alejandro poured coffee, the bitterness anchoring him. And Webb, Valeria's lips thinned. Webb is furious. He has allies still free. Men not caught last night. They will not sit idle while their empire crumbles. Alejandro's gut tightened. "My horses are safe now. That is all that matters." Valeria shook her head. Dorado is still their target. If they can't steal him, they will destroy him. Without him, your testimony carries less weight. With him, you are the greatest threat to their scheme. The truth chilled Alejandro more than the mountain air. He pictured Dorado's proud head, the golden sheen of his coat, the calm wisdom in his eyes. To imagine him harmed was unbearable. By noon, visitors began arriving uninvited. A pair of local reporters parked at the gates, calling out questions about the raid. Alejandro ignored them, but their cameras whirred, capturing every angle of the ranch. Soon after came two men in pressed suits representing an insurance company that had long refused his claims. Now, suddenly, they wished to review their files. Alejandro sent them away, his patience frayed. Word traveled fast in the horse world. Breeders from as far as Texas called, offering support, asking how to protect themselves. Alejandro tried to answer, but found his voice faltering. He was no crusader, only a rancher clinging to the fragments of his life. Yet destiny had thrust him into a role larger than he had ever sought. Valeria closed her laptop and stood by the window. "Look outside," she said. Alejandro followed her gaze. Parked along the dirt road beyond the fence was a dark sedan. Its windows were tinted, its engine off, yet Alejandro felt the weight of eyes watching from within. The vehicle did not move for hours. Trueno stood rigid on the ridge above, ears pricked, body taut as if he too sensed the threat. "They are probing us," Valeria whispered, "testing your resolve." That night Alejandro dreamed of Rosa. His grandmother stood in the pasture, her shawl wrapped tight, her hand resting on Dorado's mane. "Horses see the soul," she told him, her voice carrying both love and warning. But she turned away before he could answer, vanishing into mist. He woke drenched in sweat, heart hammering, the echo of her words heavy in his mind. The following day, Agent Ramirez returned with her team, cataloging more evidence from the seized trailer. She pulled Alejandro aside. "Be prepared for retaliation," she warned. "Ashworth's empire is not toppled yet. Money like his does not vanish in a single arrest." Alejandro asked the question that gnawed at him. "Will they come here again?" Ramirez did not flinch. "They already are." She explained that messages intercepted overnight revealed instructions to discredit Alejandro publicly. Articles would surface questioning his breeding practices, accusing him of fraud himself, painting him as unstable. It was a strategy of character assassination, as old as corruption itself. Alejandro felt the familiar pressure of despair, but forced himself to stand straighter. Let them write what they will. Truth is stronger. Ramirez's eyes softened. "Truth must be defended, Señor Cruz. Do not underestimate their reach." After she departed, Valeria joined Alejandro in the barn. He brushed Dorado's coat in long, steady strokes, each movement calming his hands, though his mind remained restless. Valeria spoke quietly. "You must prepare for a trial, not only in court but in the court of public opinion. They will try to make you the villain. If you falter, others will lose hope." Alejandro looked at her sharply. "I am no politician. I do not crave a stage." "You were chosen," she said simply, glancing toward Trueno grazing on the ridge. "Some guardians appear when needed most. Some men, too." The weight of her words settled heavily on him. That evening, Alejandro walked the perimeter fences, the cold biting into his skin. The ranch seemed quieter than ever, yet his nerves thrummed with the knowledge of unseen watchers. He paused by the south pasture where Trueno waited, the Mustang's eyes glinting in the moonlight. Alejandro whispered, "Why me?" But Trueno only tossed his head, mane rippling, as if dismissing the question. On the third day after the raid, the first volley of retaliation struck. Newspapers carried headlines not about the massive fraud exposed, but about Alejandro himself. Anonymous sources accused him of exaggerating losses, of staging the theft for insurance money, of colluding with Valeria for attention. Lies spread faster than truth. Alejandro read the words with clenched fists, the bile of injustice rising in his throat. Valeria urged him to ignore it. "The network knows the truth. Those who matter stand with you." But Alejandro knew lies had power. They eroded trust, whispered doubts into ears already primed by envy or rivalry. He felt the ground shifting beneath him once more, the web tightening. That night, as he sat by the fire, Trueno appeared suddenly at the window, his silhouette stark against the starlit sky. Alejandro rose and stepped outside. The Mustang stamped his hoof, tossed his head, then turned toward the forest. Alejandro followed, heart pounding. Trueno led him to the ridge overlooking the valley. Below, headlights glowed faintly in the distance. Another vehicle parked where none should be. Alejandro felt the cold of realization crawl down his spine. The enemy was not retreating. They were watching, waiting, weaving their web tighter around him. He stood in the silence of the mountain night, the Mustang beside him, and knew with certainty that the battle had only just begun. Alejandro Cruz stood at the threshold of his ranch house, watching the dust rise from the distant road as another car approached. It was the third that morning, and each one carried strangers with notebooks, cameras, or briefcases full of accusations disguised as questions. The world that once ignored him now refused to let him breathe. Reporters, lawyers, self-proclaimed investigators, all orbiting his land like scavengers. His horses stirred uneasily in the pastures, sensing the disruption in their guardian's soul. Inside, Valeria Marquez was on her laptop again, her fingers tapping furiously across the keys as she dismantled yet another smear campaign. She barely looked up when Alejandro entered, though her voice was tight with frustration. "They are faster than I imagined. Articles in 3 states claim you staged the raid. One even says Dorado was never stolen at all." Alejandro's fists clenched at his sides. "Lies, all of them." "Of course," Valeria replied. "But lies shouted loud enough become truth to those who want to believe them." He moved to the window, staring out at the figure on the ridge. Trueno stood as he always did, scars carved into his flanks, eyes fixed on the horizon. Alejandro envied the Mustang's silence, his immunity to slander. Horses saw the soul, Rosa had said, but men rarely cared to look past their own prejudices. By noon, Alejandro found himself standing before a crowd of reporters outside the corral. Their questions buzzed like hornets. Did you fabricate the thefts for insurance money? Were you complicit in Dr. Marquez's schemes? How do you respond to allegations that your breeding program was already failing? His mouth dried, words tangled in his throat. He thought of Dorado, of the foals born in trust and raised in partnership. He thought of Rosa's hands guiding his as a boy, teaching him the weight of responsibility. He raised his chin. "My horses are my life," he said. "I would burn this ranch to the ground before I betrayed them." Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled. Yet he saw doubt lingering in their eyes, hungry for contradiction. Valeria pulled him away before the swarm could press harder. Back inside, she placed a trembling hand on his arm. "You must not falter," she warned. "The more you waver, the stronger their lies grow." That evening, Agent Ramirez returned with new developments. Ashworth's lawyers were demanding Alejandro's immediate deposition, hoping to trap him in contradictions that could discredit his testimony. "The trial may not begin for months," Ramirez explained, "but the shadow war has already started. They will try to break you before you ever see a courtroom." Alejandro felt the pressure mounting, a noose tightening around his throat. He walked to the barn for refuge, brushing Dorado's coat until his hands steadied. The stallion leaned into him, eyes calm, as if lending him strength. Trueno appeared at the gate, watching, a silent reminder that he was not alone. Days blurred into nights. Letters arrived from banks demanding payments. Threatening calls echoed through the phone lines. Anonymous messages appeared in his mailbox, warning him to back down before it was too late. Alejandro burned them all. But each flame left ashes in his chest. One night he dreamed of Lucero, the filly stolen first. In the dream she stood in the pasture, her mane glinting silver under moonlight. She spoke without words, her gaze heavy with meaning. "Fight," she seemed to say. "Not just for me, but for all of us." Alejandro awoke gasping, the sound of hooves fading into the darkness. Valeria pushed harder with the network of breeders, gathering testimony, genetic records, financial data. Each piece of evidence added weight to their cause, but also increased the danger. Their adversaries struck back with precision, planting stories that Valeria herself was a disgraced scientist using Alejandro as a pawn. They mocked her past, distorted her research, painted her as a zealot. Alejandro confronted her one evening. "They are destroying you as much as me." She met his gaze squarely. "I knew the cost when I began. If they succeed in silencing us, countless more will lose their herds. If we prevail, we change everything." Her courage reignited his own. Still, the strain grew heavier. The ranch hands whispered about leaving, unwilling to live under constant surveillance. Buyers hesitated to sign contracts. Creditors circled closer. Alejandro stood at the edge of ruin once again, this time not from theft, but from reputation shredded by invisible knives. One afternoon, as Alejandro walked the northern pasture, Trueno approached closer than ever before. The Mustang's eyes locked with his, unblinking, filled with something beyond animal instinct. Alejandro extended his hand. Trueno touched it with his muzzle, a gesture so deliberate it felt like an oath. Alejandro whispered, "Then I will not give up. Not while you still believe in me." The weeks ahead brought hearings, depositions, endless battles in the courts of law and public opinion. Alejandro sat in sterile rooms while lawyers fired questions like arrows, twisting his words, baiting him into anger. Yet each time he faltered, he remembered Dorado's steady gaze, Trueno's scars, Rosa's voice. He answered with calm, with truth, even when the truth felt like a blade against his skin. The shadow war deepened. Allies turned cautious, some withdrawing in fear, but others emerged stronger. Breeders once silent found their voices. rallying around Alejandro's defiance. Journalists began to question the sheer volume of coordinated attacks, exposing patterns of manipulation that hinted at Ashworth's still sprawling influence. Through it all, Alejandro endured. Every night he walked the pastures, speaking softly to his horses, letting their presence ground him. Trueno remained his constant sentinel, a figure half wild, half divine, reminding him that guardianship was not chosen, but demanded. By the time winter snow dusted the Rockies, Alejandro realized something had shifted. He was no longer just a rancher fighting for his herd. He had become a symbol, unwilling though he might be. The enemies who once dismissed him now feared him. The allies who once doubted now looked to him. The trial of shadows was far from over, but Alejandro knew one truth above all. Lies could spread like fire, but truth endured like stone. And with Dorado by his side, Valeria at his shoulder, snow fell in heavy silence across the valley, blanketing the pastures in white and muting the sounds of the world. Alejandro Cruz stood at the fence line, his breath misting in the freezing air as he watched Sol Dorado paw at the ground, his golden coat a beacon against the winter gloom. The stallion's defiance in the face of cold reminded Alejandro of his own resolve, though cracks were forming in both man and horse. The months of strain had hollowed him, yet he stood, unwilling to bend, unwilling to yield. Inside the ranch house, the fire snapped and hissed as Valeria Marquez laid out documents across the table. Evidence, depositions, witness statements, all assembled into a fortress of paper and ink. Yet for every piece they gathered, the opposition erected walls higher and stronger. The lawyers of equestrian heritage flooded the courts with counterclaims, demanding delays, muddying the waters until truth seemed buried beneath procedure. Valeria rubbed her temples, exhaustion etched into her features. "We are winning battles, Alejandro, but the war grinds us to dust." Alejandro sank into a chair, the weight of the day pressing him low. The ranch hands had dwindled to two, the others gone to safer employment. Buyers still hesitated, creditors still circled. The ranch teetered at the edge of collapse, even as the evidence of fraud piled higher. He stared at Valeria's papers until the words blurred. "How much more can we endure?" She looked up, her eyes sharp despite the fatigue. "As much as it takes." That is. Trueno stood at the ridge, unmoving, snow clinging to his mane, his eyes reflecting a light older than time. Alejandro trudged through the drifts until he stood before the Mustang. He whispered, "How do you endure, old one? How do you never falter?" Trueno's breath clouded the air, warm against the cold. And for a moment, Alejandro felt as though the Mustang answered without words. "You endure because there is no other path." Days bled into nights. Court hearings dragged on. Reporters still prowled, their cameras capturing Alejandro's gaunt frame, his tired eyes. The articles continued, some praising him as a hero, others branding him a fraud. The contradictions tore at his reputation, until even he questioned how the world truly saw him. He sought solace in his horses, brushing their coats, murmuring to them in the dim light of the barn. Dorado's calm strength anchored him, though fear lingered. Fear that one mistake would cost him everything again. One evening, as wind howled through the eaves, a rock shattered the kitchen window. Alejandro rushed to the porch, shotgun in hand, but found only tire tracks fading into snow. A note lay weighted under the stone. "Stop now, or you will bury more than horses." His blood ran cold. Valeria urged him to alert Ramirez, but Alejandro burned the note instead. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him shaken. Yet, in the privacy of the night he lay awake, hand on the rifle by his bed, listening for every creak, every whisper of wind. The breaking point came weeks later. Alejandro arrived at the corral at dawn to find one of the broodmares bleeding from a gash across her flank, the fence cut deliberately. She lived, but the message was clear. Rage consumed him, hotter than any fear. He stormed into the house, his voice shaking. "They touched my horses, Valeria. They crossed the line." Valeria met his fury with steel of her own. "Then we strike back. No more silence, no more defense. We take this fight to the public, louder than they can silence us." Within days, Alejandro found himself standing in front of cameras, not as a reluctant witness,
but as an accuser. He spoke of the thefts, the forgeries, the lies. He described the pain of watching his horses vanish, the betrayal of law enforcement too slow or too compromised to act. His words cut raw, unpolished, but honest. Viewers across the country saw not a fraud, but a man scarred by injustice. The tide began, slowly, to shift. Support poured in. Breeders from distant states sent statements of solidarity. Donations trickled toward his mounting legal fees. Journalists dug deeper, unearthing ties between Ashworth's empire and corrupt officials. The narrative cracked, light bleeding through the shadows. But victory carried cost. Alejandro became a prisoner of his own land, stalked by enemies who now knew his every routine. His body ached with exhaustion, his mind frayed with worry. Even Dorado seemed to sense it, pressing closer, whickering softly, as though urging his master not to surrender. One night, Valeria found Alejandro slumped at the barn table, his head buried in his arms. She touched his shoulder gently. "You cannot carry this alone." He lifted his eyes, hollow with fatigue. "Then carry it with me," he whispered. She did not hesitate. Always. Together they rose, together they faced the darkness. Trueno appeared once more at the gate, scars glistening in moonlight, eyes unwavering. Alejandro felt strength flow back into him, not his own, but borrowed from those who stood beside him: Valeria, Dorado, Trueno, even Rosa, whose voice still lingered in memory. The breaking point had come, and it had nearly shattered him, but in the fragments he found something sharper than despair: resolve. He looked out across the snow-covered valley, the mountains looming eternal, and knew that the storm was not yet over, but neither was he. The valley was restless as spring thawed the snow and turned the pastures into seas of emerald. Alejandro Cruz rose before dawn each morning, his boots crunching across damp earth as he moved from stall to stall, checking every horse with the vigilance of a sentry. Sol Dorado nickered softly at his approach, eyes clear and steady. But Alejandro felt the storm pressing closer with each passing day. The fraud trials were no longer distant rumors. They were becoming reality, and his name stood at the center of them, like a torch that could either guide or burn. Valeria Marquez had transformed the ranch's dining room into a command center. Laptops, files, and charts sprawled across the table, forming a tapestry of evidence connecting Ashworth's empire to dozens of crimes. Journalists came and went, scribbling notes, recording her words, piecing together the scandal that now dominated national headlines. She never stopped, rarely even slept. Alejandro admired her tenacity, but he worried that the fire she carried might consume her. The government's case had grown vast. Ramirez visited often, briefing them with the calm precision of a soldier preparing for war. Ashworth would face charges of racketeering, fraud, conspiracy, and corruption. Webb and his operatives had already begun to turn on each other, each desperate to cut a deal in exchange for lighter sentences. Yet, the higher the investigation climbed, the more resistance they encountered. Powerful figures in the industry, men and women with fortunes tied to forged pedigrees, pushed back hard. Alejandro was summoned to testify at a preliminary hearing. He arrived in the city flanked by federal escorts, his cowboy hat a jarring contrast against the sterile marble of the courthouse. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved toward his face. "Is it true you staged the thefts? Did you and Dr. Marquez manipulate evidence? How much money did you gain from the scandal?" He ignored them all, stepping through the doors with Dorado's image fixed in his mind like a talisman. Inside, the hearing stretched for hours. Lawyers fired questions like arrows, trying to unravel his credibility. Alejandro answered with patience, his voice steady though sweat dampened his collar. He spoke of Lucero disappearing, of searching until his voice broke, of watching empty stalls multiply like wounds. He spoke of Rosa's words, "Horses see the soul," and how Dorado's eyes had guided him through despair.
The courtroom fell quiet at times, even the lawyers subdued by the raw truth that could not be faked. When it was over, Alejandro stepped outside to a wall of flashing bulbs. Reporters shouted again, but this time the questions carried less venom, more awe. One young journalist asked, "Señor Cruz, what gave you the strength to keep fighting?" Alejandro paused, his voice low but firm. "Because my horses never stopped believing in me, and because truth does not surrender." Back at the ranch, tension coiled tighter. Trucks slowed along the road, strangers loitered near the gates, shadows lingered too long at the tree line. Trueno remained a constant sentinel, his scarred body a silhouette against dusk and dawn alike. Alejandro drew comfort from the Mustang's vigilance, yet he knew instinctively that danger was circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, Valeria closed her laptop with trembling hands. "They will try to destroy us at the reckoning," she whispered. "Not just in court, but in the court of public opinion. They cannot afford for you to remain a hero." Alejandro sat beside her, staring into the fire. "Then let them try. I have survived worse nights." But privately he wrestled with fear. The ranch still balanced on the edge of ruin. Contracts hung uncertain, creditors circled, and the horses themselves bore the scars of months of chaos. He walked among them under moonlight, murmuring reassurances he barely believed himself. Dorado pressed against him, powerful and warm, reminding him that strength did not always mean certainty. As the trial date approached, allies rallied. Breeders across the country signed declarations of support. Honest journalists published exposés revealing the depth of Ashworth's empire. Donations flowed in, small and large, enough to keep the ranch afloat for another season. Yet for every step forward came two back. Alejandro's mailbox overflowed with threats. Anonymous calls at night promised ruin. Still he endured. The day of reckoning arrived beneath a sky heavy with storm clouds. Alejandro dressed carefully, pulling on the suit he rarely wore. The tie Rosa had given him long ago, still faint with her lavender scent. He looked in the mirror and saw not just a rancher but a man forged by fire and loss, a man carrying generations of heritage on his shoulders. At the courthouse, the air pulsed with tension. Protesters gathered outside, some shouting in support, others condemning him as a fraud. Inside the grand chamber, Ashworth sat flanked by his lawyers, his face a mask of arrogance. Webb avoided Alejandro's gaze, his shackled hands betraying the fall of his confidence. Ramirez guided Alejandro to the witness stand. Valeria sat in the gallery, her eyes steady, her presence a lifeline. Alejandro took the oath and spoke. He told of theft, betrayal, conspiracy, and resilience. He described the night of the raid, the sonic weapons, the way Dorado staggered yet refused to yield. He told of Trueno, the guardian who led him to the hidden valley, who revealed the truth when all seemed lost. The courtroom held its breath, caught in the gravity of his testimony. Ashworth's lawyers tried to shred him, hurling accusations and twisting words. But Alejandro stood unbroken. Each question he answered with calm defiance, his voice carrying the weight of lived truth. No fabrication, no smear could erase the scars on his soul. By the end of the day, even the judge seemed moved. Proceedings would continue, evidence still to be weighed, but the tide had shifted. Alejandro stepped outside into the storm as rain lashed the streets. Reporters surged again, but he pushed past them, lifting his face to the downpour. For the first time in months, the rain felt like cleansing rather than drowning. Back at Luna Vista Ranch, Trueno waited at the ridge. Lightning split the sky, illuminating his wild frame, fierce and eternal. Alejandro raised his hand in silent salute. The reckoning had begun, and though battles still lay ahead, he knew now that the truth walked beside him. The storm that had gathered for so long finally began to break. Months of testimony, cross-examinations, and mountains of evidence culminated in a trial that would be studied for years. Alejandro Cruz stood once more in the courthouse, not as a man hounded by lies, but as a witness to a truth too vast to silence. Across the room, Vincent Ashworth sat hollow-eyed, the arrogance drained from him, his empire dismantled. Marcus Webb slumped in his chair, his gaze fixed on the floor, the swagger of his cruelty replaced by resignation. The verdicts rang like thunder. Guilty on all counts, The weight of justice fell heavy, sentences measured in decades, fortunes seized, reputations obliterated. Alejandro felt no triumph, only a profound quiet. Justice had come, but it was not victory. Victory was watching Sol Dorado gallop freely in his pasture, his mane catching the wind, his bloodlines untainted by fraud. Victory was hearing the laughter of children visiting the ranch, their hands outstretched to stroke the muzzles of foals born into safety rather than fear. Valeria Marquez walked beside him as they left the courthouse. The crowd erupted outside, cameras flashing, reporters shouting, but their noise seemed distant. She turned to him with tired eyes that still burned with determination. "It is done," she said. He nodded, though in his heart he knew it was never truly done. The forces that had corrupted the industry could not be erased in a single trial, but they had been broken, exposed, driven from the shadows. Back at Luna Vista Ranch, the world had changed. The pastures shimmered green with spring growth, the barns repaired, the fences fortified. Alejandro had paid off his debts with the support of honest breeders who flocked to his cause. Contracts arrived from across the country, eager to restore integrity through Dorado's lineage. The stallion became a symbol of authenticity, his very name synonymous with resilience. Alejandro established scholarships in Rosa's name for young riders and breeders who lacked resources. He welcomed students to the ranch, teaching them not only the craft of horsemanship, but the philosophy his grandmother had instilled in him. Horses see the soul. He repeated the words often, believing them more with each passing day. The children listened wide-eyed as he told them stories of Lucero, Viento, and the others stolen but returned. They learned that a horse was not property, but a partner, a guardian, a mirror. Valeria founded the Equine Heritage Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to safeguarding bloodlines and preventing fraud. She spoke at conferences, her words reshaping policies, her research strengthening genetic testing so deception could never again infiltrate so deeply. She credited Alejandro always, but he deflected, insisting her brilliance had carried the fight. Together they built something larger than themselves, a bulwark for generations to come. Trueno remained, though never fully theirs. The Mustang haunted the ridges and tree lines, sometimes vanishing for weeks, sometimes appearing at dawn with the weight of mystery in his eyes. Alejandro often found him watching the ranch, scars glowing faintly in moonlight. Once, late in summer, Alejandro approached and laid a hand against his neck. "Thank you, old guardian," he whispered. Trueno held his gaze for a long moment before trotting back into the wild, untamed and eternal. The ranch flourished, but Alejandro never forgot the cost. He remembered every night of fear, every whisper of doubt, every moment when despair threatened to swallow him. He carried those memories not as wounds but as lessons. When visitors asked how he had endured, he told them it was not strength but faith. Faith in Dorado, faith in Valeria, faith in Trueno, and faith in truth. One autumn morning, he found himself standing on the porch as the sun painted the Rockies in hues of fire. Children were laughing in the pastures, foals darting like shadows across the grass. Valeria sat nearby with her laptop closed for once, her eyes soft with rare rest. Alejandro held a photograph in his hands, the one of Rosa with her hand on Dorado's mane. Beneath it, her handwriting flowed with steady certainty. Horses see the soul, and the soul sees the truth. Tears blurred his vision, but he smiled. He understood at last. Rosa's words had not been metaphor, but prophecy. Horses had seen his soul when he could not. They had chosen him when he doubted himself. They had carried him through the darkness and led him to light. The equestrian world hailed him as a hero, though Alejandro rejected the title. He was still a rancher, still a man rising before dawn to mend fences and feed horses. Yet everywhere he went, people recognized him, shook his hand, thanked him for protecting what they loved. He accepted their gratitude with humility, always redirecting it toward Dorado, Valeria, and Trueno. Without them, he would have been nothing. As years passed, the scandal faded into history, but its lessons endured. New regulations ensured bloodlines were tested, registration papers verified, corruption rooted out. Breeders spoke more openly about ethics, about the sacred bond between human and horse. The industry began to heal, scarred but stronger. Alejandro grew older, his hair silvering, his hands rougher, but his spirit unbowed. Dorado aged beside him, still regal, still proud, his legacy carried on through countless foals. Valeria remained his partner in both struggle and peace, her fire tempered by years of shared triumphs and burdens. Trueno appeared less often, but always at moments that mattered, as though bound by something deeper than chance. One night, Alejandro dreamed again of Lucero, standing in moonlit pasture. This time she was not lost, not calling in despair. She stood calmly, her eyes soft with gratitude. When he woke, he knew the circle had closed. The horses taken from him had not vanished in vain. Their loss had sparked a war that saved thousands more. The legacy of the battle was not measured in verdicts or contracts, but in the laughter of children, the whicker of foals, the whisper of wind through mountain pines. Alejandro felt Rosa's presence in every sunrise, in every steady gaze of Dorado, in every fleeting glimpse of Trueno. Sometimes visitors asked him what it all meant, what lesson he carried from those years of fire. He answered simply, "That truth is not a thing we own, but a thing we serve. That horses, in their silence, remind us of who we are meant to be, and that some guardians, human or animal, choose us when we are too weak to choose ourselves." As twilight deepened over Luna Vista Ranch, Alejandro walked the pastures one last time that day. Dorado grazed with his mares, foals darted like sparks across the field, and on the ridge, Trueno stood, eternal as ever. Alejandro lifted his hand in salute. The Mustang raised his head, eyes glowing in the dying light. For a heartbeat, the world held still, past and present bound together in silent understanding. The legacy was not his alone, but shared among them all: horse, woman, Mustang, and the unseen spirits that guided them. It was a legacy of resilience, of guardianship, of souls seen and truths preserved. And as the stars broke through the darkness above, Alejandro Cruz knew with certainty that the bond forged in trial would outlast lifetimes, carried forward in every hoofbeat, every breath, every dawn yet to come.